Well, in the Slocan Valley here, I'd say that two of the pioneers of organizing labor in the lumber working industry would be Ted Sutherland of Winlaw and Chuck Varney of Vallican. And those two people carried on those activities for years in the IWA after it came here. And I can't put a time exactly on when the IWA became active in this area, because my first experience, as I might have mentioned to you, was that there was an organization known as the Southern Interior Lumber Workers Association, and I have no idea what became of it. I tried to follow it up in a magazine called The Lumber Worker, and well, a paper that was put out, I think, on a monthly basis, and they just sort of disappeared, or I guess overwhelmed by the events of post-war union activity. But in 1946 approximately, I worked for them. I worked for a small logging firm in the area, in the Little Slocan, and because of the working conditions there, the bunkhouse conditions and the complete lack of facilities for washing up and so on, you know, they were so bad that it made me think that there's got to be something better than this, you see. And I'd been reading these papers like the Lumber Worker and so on, and I went to this office of this Southern Interior Lumber Workers, and I applied to join, and I think I was charged a fee of 50 cents to join up. Two others joined up with me, and so we went back Monday and started work, and in the evening we started talking to the other employees to have a delegation go and see the boss, as it was. There was no management sort of team or anything, just a one-man show, and he promptly had us leave camp and go home. That was the end of that.
Where was the office?
The office in Nelson for the lumber worker, for the association.
Was it in Nelson?
Yeah, it was in Nelson, and it was located on the corner of Vernon and Josephine, and upstairs in a little room there that this building is being renovated now into apartments and a restaurant down below and so on. There's a big sign up in front there, T.S. Horswell and Sons, wholesale and retail merchants and tobacconists and confectionery and so on. So then I got working for the West Kootenai Power and Light Company, and they also were, the employees were represented by an association. There was no union there. And from the beginning, I started working on what we called the outside crew. You worked on construction of new buildings and things of that nature, fencing and cutting brush and so forth. And this association was really had no authority, in a sense, you know, to bargain with the management. It was just a representation. You sat in and you were more or less told what the situation was going to be rather than bargain for anything. And as a result of a Monday morning confrontation with the foreman in the wintertime, when we were working on really steep side hill situation, and the carpenters of those days carried hatchets that were just like sharpened like razors and hand saws and so on, and they asked another man and I to sand the paths and the scaffolds and the planks that we walked up on so they wouldn't fall, you know. And of course we were doing this without the foreman asking us to do it, and he told us to never mind and get busy doing something else, and that resulted in a confrontation, and he fired me. But he didn't really have the authority to do so. But I challenged him on this, and so we wound up then going to management, and I eventually wound up going home as a sort of a protest to this situation, and the management and this employees association got their heads together the next day and reviewed what had happened and insisted that I come back. And it was only a few months after that that the employees banded together and brought in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers to represent them. And that union, Local 999, was the first electrical worker local in the interior of the province here, in the Kootenays anyway, and eventually evolved into the City of Nelson Work Crew and a number of others, but each with their own local. Mm-hmm. So getting back to the IWA, I spent 10 years all told at the West Kootenay. The first 2 or 3 years were broken up into spells when the fellows, former employees, came back from the war. They got their jobs back and their seniority counted, and so those of us with less seniority were laid off, and then an opening came and I was rehired, and I spent another 8 years there, and so in 1955 I left there, and my work from there on involved moving heavy machinery around for a transport outfit located in Nelson, and so I then became more and more involved in the woodworking industry as they would want machinery moved in and out of their logging sites and road building sites and so forth, and
you were operating a float?
Low bed, as they call it, or a float if you want to call it, yeah. And that carried on for 3.5 years or so. And then I went into the trucking business on my own and wound up working with IWA people. And that started in 1959. So by that time the IWA was fairly well established in the interior here. And two people that are still around who were quite involved in the newly established IWA. One of them is Karl Johnson, who lives down here at South Slocan. Mm-hmm. And the other is Wayne Nowlin, that lives over in Cranbrook. And I think that Nowlin has spent N-O-W-L-I-N, if I'm not mistaken. I should look it up in the phone book. He's got a brother in Nelson. And another person whom I met in that time, who was not yet involved, who was still working for the CPR, was Jack Munro.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was working for the CPR in Nelson, and he left the CPR and got on at Kootenay Forest, and in no time at all he was involved in the IWA and on the board of directors and so on. So, if I could just go back to those early days, there was several of the companies that worked were of any consequence was in my time. You know, there was others come and gone before me, such as J.B. Winlaw, sawmill in Winlaw, and Coe's mill at Coe Siding, and so on. But at that time there was a Cady Lumber and Pole. They came up here from Sandpoint, Idaho, and established themselves in here, and Schaefer and Hitchcock.
These were all, they were from Sandpoint, weren't they?
Yeah.
Well, I was interested in that. You mentioned them the last time we talked. Do you know a bit about who Cady was?
Well, all I know is that from my conversations with other employees I never had a direct conversation with him. He came up here as an agent, or yes, I suppose you could call it an agent of, I believe it was Schaefer and Hitchcock, and operated in this area on their behalf, and as he grew, he went into it on his own. And I don't know if he severed relationships with the others. I doubt it. I think that they were still behind him in some form or another, because it took a lot of capital to get, into a sawmill business and so on.
His sawmill site was in Nelson?
Yes. Every sawmill in Nelson, practically, in my time anyway, has been down in that same site. It would be Cady Lumber and Pole, and then it was, Deer Park and Glacier Lumber. Those firms, whatever the connection were between them, I don't know, but they came up here, and it seems that they took over. I remember a fellow by the name of Mr. Patterson. Bob Patterson was the manager there for a number of years, and I think it was Deer Park Lumber for a little while, then it became Glacier Lumber, and they became quite a big organization. And eventually they sold out, I guess, to the whoever formed Kootenai Forest Products were former management people for Glacier Lumber, the Slocan family. And they carried on the management of Kootenai Forest Products, but the Eddie Match Company got into it then. And then everything changed, There was long distance sort of relationship, and seems to me the management was left a lot to be desired. There was managers coming and going, and you never knew where you were at with them for quite a while. And there were times when it was very good, a good setup, and by the standards of those days anyway. But the IWA followed along very strongly in the Kootenai Forest Products lifetime, to the extent that when Kootenai Forest Products were taken over by Westar, and I probably that's not the right terminology. What happened was Kootenai Forest Products were going to close down, and the NDP government under Dave Barrett took it over and kept it going. And then as soon as the Barrett government were defeated and the Bill Bennett came into power, he just disbanded everything that he could get his hands on, such as David Thompson University and that sawmill and so on, and he put it into Westar, which eventually became Brick, and that was the end of a good story as far as Nelson was concerned.
Who was the outfit that you were working for in the Little Slocan back in the...
Tadesco, James Tadesco had a little logging operation, and he logged around Crescent Valley. I'd known him for years. He started logging here in Crescent Valley on this mountainside, I think in 1938 or somewhere around there. And after logging for 2 or 3 years on this mountain here, he went over and logged on that mountain up there. And then he got bigger, and he built a sawmill of his own, and went into an abandoned logging site up in the Little Slocan that I think had been opened up originally by John Masloff. John was a small-time logging contractor and supplied wood to Kootenai Forest or Burns Lumber or whoever was closest, you see.
What were you doing for him at the time that you joined the lumber workers?
I was what they called working on the bull ropes, for the loading machine. And you had to have they took if they graduated from using tongs to lift the logs, where you had to grab the log right about center, and you had to have a pretty good eye to judge where the center of weight would be, whereas the center of the log was one thing, but because of the taper, one end was going to be heavier than the other. And so they took these tongs apart originally and gave each man a half a tong. See, ordinarily they folded, on a pin, on a hinge pin, and they had rings in the ends to hook the ropes into, and as you pulled, the harder you pulled, the tighter the tong gripped. Well, they took these apart and put a rope on them, and you went down to the far end and you tucked the tong into the end of the log, and the other fellow did the same, and the log came up practically straight. And you could put a load of logs on so fast with those things, and a single drum loading machine, as we called it, a jammer, and it had an upright mast and a boom that's angled out at about a 45 degree. You could graduate that to whatever you wanted to reach out, and it would swing. It was free swinging, but you would tilt the mast a little towards the mountainside, and then when you were pulling a log up, the boom would swing around over the bank and help to lift the log as well as drag it up. And it worked very well. And it came up, because it was pulled over to the side, it would come up clear of the side of the truck, so it wouldn't bump into the side of the truck and knock the logs loose or anything. It would come up and just go up the top, and then as soon as it got clear of that, the boom would, by a force of gravity, would swing over the load. And the truck driver, who was his own top loader in most cases, in this case, would grab the rope from the guy on the front and guide the log to where he wanted, and then the fellow on the jammer would just drop it right there, you see. And you could put a load of logs on so fast, and you just became like a cat, going down that bank, because the guy on the jammer would hold the brake just slightly, and you're going down the bank, you had almost total control of where you were going to land and so on. You could jump 8 or 10 feet at a time, and you'd land softly, you see, because he'd just pay out the line fast enough for you to go down. And sometimes the logs would be as far down as from here to that road, 50 below the highway. We would skid logs into those places with crawler tractors and horses, and come to the edge of the bank and just roll them over. And we'd have decks of logs like that all the way along the road. And you would just move from one deck to the other. There were guy lines that you'd had to take down and replace and so on. And so I was doing that at the time when I joined the union, the association.
How old were you?
I guess 26 or 27.
Did you have a family then?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had 3 children. 2 children, I guess, at that time. Yeah.
And did you have
I had 3 when I left the West Kootenai that time.
What did you think the response to you joining the union would be?
Well, I didn't have any thoughts as to what the response would be joining the union. I just felt that was a fundamental right of anybody to join a union, just as it is to go to church or do anything else. The way I guess I looked at it was that these people were in a business, and they needed the service of people that were capable of doing providing a service they needed. They needed somebody that could run that jammer. They needed somebody that could handle those bull ropes and maintain machinery or do a number of things. They needed people like that. And I was able to provide that service along with a lot of other people, some better than others, So I should have something to say about my life and what I needed to get out of the service I was able to provide. But they didn't recognize these kind of things. Management refused to. They played the role of a godfather, and you worked for them, and you did what they said, and you considered yourself so bloody lucky to have a job. They needed you. If they didn't get you, they had to go and get somebody else. They couldn't shut down. They had commitments to the bank and so on, to their creditors.
So, were you worried about losing your job?
Not in that sense, not that I came to work worrying about losing my job. It seemed to me I didn't have those kind of premonitions or I just never thought along those kind of lines. Certainly it was a hardship when you were out of work and you had nowhere to turn. But those kinds of situations can arise for a number of reasons. You could become ill and there was no Medicare system or anything. The outfit could go broke and couldn't pay you and so on, and you would find yourself in those conditions a lot of times. And so that seemed to be all in the process of living, and you just went out and looked for work somewhere else, you know. Tried to do something else.
How did you find out about the lumber workers?
I guess just by word of mouth, you know. When you see, we were working in this particular camp, just to give an example, and we were going into this time of the year, and you got up, well, you slept overnight in a little cabin with 3 beds and a tin heater in it, and of course, if you opened the damper and that thing was so small that you were either sweating in bed or you were freezing. And once you had started to sweat, then it was hard to keep warm, you know. So by the time you got up in the morning, if nobody stoked the fire in the night, and not likely anybody would, they were bundled up in blankets. You brought your own blankets and everything, you know. And you come out of there, you know, all dressed up in your mackinaw and everything else, and you came down to the kitchen, and out in the plain open, there was a waterfall falling over a little cliff, and that waterfall was used in the hot weather to keep the meat and milk and stuff from going sour. It flowed over a screened-in compartment, and then it flowed across, and you had to have high boots on. The mud was that deep where you went to wash. There was a bench, big long bench built out there, about 3 feet across on the top, and several basins sitting out there, and a huge cauldron of hot water packed out from the kitchen was set on the end of this bench. And lots of mornings when the sleet and snow, you know, this time of year there'd be sleet and snow up there at that elevation, you know, 5,000-6,000 feet, and you'd have to pack slabs up from the mill and throw them in there so that you wouldn't go over your boot tops in the muck to go and wash. You're washing with your cap on, and you almost had to have your mitts on to wash. So these were the kind of conditions, you see, that we're not happy with. And when I went to this gentleman, he called me in the office after work Monday and asked me what this was all about. And so I was explaining to him, just as I'm explaining to you. And he said, you know, Bob, he said, when we left Italy to come to this country, our houses didn't even have board floors in them. We had dirt floors. And, you know, I'm sitting there, yeah, you know, with all due respect to the man, you know, and so on. And I said, that's right, Mr. Tadesco. You came here to better yourself. I said, when you logged in Crescent Valley for years, you rented a horse stable from my father. Yeah, that's right. And I said, and it had wooden floors in it and so on, which we don't have here for human beings. I think you better go home, he said. And that was the end of that. So those are the kind of things that you were faced with, and
no one had visited your camp from the union, or there wasn't a person?
Oh no, there wasn't even a person in charge. There was a person like a secretary, and if there was somebody who was around soliciting the business of that union, as we would call a business agent today, there was, if that person was around, I never got to know who it was. And I think that it, you know, was more or less preoccupied with closer into town because they didn't have the money and the resources to go out to these little camps and so on, you know. But it would have been an ideal situation for an organization like the IWA to come along, you see. And of course, I was always very cautious about international unions. I felt very strongly, and still do, that you know, it's a big falsehood to prepare or pretend that you belong to an organization that would manage the well-being of the employees and so on from some other country, and you pay dues, of which maybe a third or a good portion of it goes down there to the international union and so on, and we get back a very small bit of it. In other words, I used to contest this process of paying dues by the IBEW to the United States, per capita dues down there, because true enough, they could give you some financial assistance to get started. But what do you penalize the people forever and ever by keep demanding a per capita due when actually they are not providing you with any more services? You know, so that was always a sore spot with me. And so I was always reluctant to get involved in too deeply in those kind of organizations, and when I was in them I kept saying, you know, we should have our own branch with its own autonomy and so on in Canada. And I think that that in itself was one of the factors that helps defeat the social order in our communities, and it helps to defeat any political process that you develop to try and establish a social order and social justice and economic justice. You hear a lot of that rhetoric today by splinter parties, you know, like the National Party and so on, voicing exactly those kind of phrases, which have been around since the 1920s that I know of, by J.S. Wordsworth and M.J. Caldwell and Stanley Knowles and others like them, and later on Ran Harding and Herbert Herridge and many, many more, David Lewis and so on, Tommy Douglas, etc., to try and do this. And these people fluctuate from one nest to another wherever there seems to be. A portion of them do, I must say that. But when I first noticed this happening, probably again after I was married in 43, and I came back here in 45. There was a fellow who was very prominent in the IWA in New Westminster, and it seems to me his last name was either his first name or his last name was Ray, and I just can't place what his other name would have been. He was very prominent in the IWA, and he was also very prominent in the CCF. And I used to wonder, was this man a socialist who got involved in the union business, or was he a union organizer who saw the benefits of getting involved in a socialist order? And he was really and truly a social democrat. He fought for better working conditions. He fought for government policy that would assist in establishing better working conditions, and yet somehow or another he seemed to be apart from those who were adamant that the company had to give, the employer had to give and give and give. I'm not saying that I know exactly where the boundaries should have been, but he seemed to have that right sense of balance between the employer and the employee that would function the best. And I don't know, there was Gordon Burns and his parents and his uncles, his family, established Burns Lumber and Passmore Lumber, which was, I couldn't distinguish between the two. I think Burns Lumber functioned in Nelson, you know, as a distribution thing. They were in building supplies and all the rest of it, but the mill operation, the logging operation up here at Passmore was known as Passmore Lumber. There was a mill in Slocan by the name of Lingle and Johnson, and there were a number of small operators, as I spoke earlier about John Masloff, and there was people like Max Baskin and so on, who every year in the spring came back into the scene and logged till fall, and the snow got deep, and they didn't have the equipment to open roads and stuff, so they just shut down for the winter. But I guess my first effort at arranging some sort of an agreement was with the Cady Lumber and Pole up in the Little Slocan. They had a camp called Camp 10, about 10 miles up from Vallican, in the backwoods in there, and so the camp was, crew were made up of quite a number of Japanese people who were forced into the Kootenays here from the coast, and quite a number of the Russian Doukhobor people, and a few like myself. And
can you just put this in a year for me? Is this in the 50s now?
no, this would still be in the late 40s.
So
Just let me think now for a minute.
was this during a time when you were laid off at West Kootenay?
Yeah, those were between those intervals. Sometimes were 6 months at a time, you know, and you had to go back to work for 2 or 3 months. And I think I was laid off twice there.
So when you were laid off one time, you'd gone up to work for Cady?
Yeah, I think I had worked for Tadesco before I ever. First job I got when I came back was with the West Kootenay for 3 or 4 months, rewinding some big generators that had suffered a burnout due to an electrical storm, and Westinghouse sent engineers in from Peterborough, Ontario, and we rewound those units. We finished up early in the spring, and so there was nothing to do. When I say early in the spring, either late in the winter or something like that, because I was still working there in January. I remember my daughter was born that winter, and that was in 46. So during the summer I worked for Cady that summer, and another summer I worked for Tadesco's, and then I got back on at the West Kootenay, and I stayed there for another 8 years. So it would probably be 46 to 47, somewhere in there, that I was working for Cady. And and the difficulty that we ran into was that the cook was Japanese, and I'd say that a third of the crew were Japanese people, and probably half of the crew were Russian-speaking people, and the balance was made up of people like myself, Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons and so on. And the Russian people were complaining that they were getting so much Japanese food that it was disagreeing with them. And you know, those items amongst a class of people who might as well say could survive off the land were a big factor. And there was 2 or 3 amongst the Doukhobor group that were fairly outspoken, you know. And one of them was Anton Kalesnikoff, a huge man. And another was Peter Chapman. And I'm sitting there and listening to these and fellas and putting in my 2 bits worth, you know, and so on. So by golly, we went and arranged a meeting with Mr. Cady. By this time had taken in a junior partner in the business, and this junior partner would visit the camp usually once a week, come up on a Tuesday or Wednesday and see how things were going, and go back to Nelson. And sometimes Mr. Cady would come up, every couple of weeks and have a look. And so when we found out when this junior partner was going to be there, and for the life of me right at this moment I can't think of his name, Page, Mr. Page, Cady and Page, we had arranged for a meeting with him. And he came over after supper, and we outlined to him what the problem was. And we discussed all that, and he agreed that, yes, he would try and do something about it. So before we broke off the meeting, we discussed with him the possibility of some kind of a wage agreement. And things were going along pretty good, and everybody had started off at 45 or 50 or so cents an hour, and maybe it would be time for another 5 or 10 cent raise in pay. Well, we dickered on this for an hour or so, and he finally agreed that they could come up a few cents. But he said, for God's sake, don't tell Gordon Burns or he'll kill me, he says, because we have an agreement with him not to increase any wages. And of course, it only took a little, almost a weekend is all it took for the word to spread to Cady's camp, to Burns's camp, So I have no idea what took place in between them. But those were the kind of things that happened without any formal association representing you. And they caused a little anxiety, as to just who might get laid off next for speaking out, because that did happen in those days.
Now, was this episode with Cady after the episode with Tadesco? After you...
I think not. I think it was before, because I felt that was quite in order, and it went very well with Mr. Page, and there were no backlash or aftermath. I did have some problems there. There were two of us hauling lumber away from the mill, and it took two of us to keep the mill clear. It was cutting pretty fast, and we had to haul it to Passmore and put it on the ramps up along the railroad track for the fellows to load it into the boxcars, and there was a separate crew down there that lived down here in Crescent Valley. And so this one particular vehicle they had was a Hayes Anderson truck. Later became Hayes Manufacturing Company, and they built some fine big logging trucks off highway as a rule. But they also built highway models. But anyway, this thing was an unending source of problems. Oh, and it was the roughest thing. You'd swear it was an iron-wheeled lumber wagon with an engine in it that was that rough. Honestly, nobody wanted to drive it. And not only that, it was very difficult to load. The way it was coupled up, it was a heavy-duty single-axle truck with a single-axle trailer, and you had to back this trailer in to these jacks, as they called them, where they piled the lumber as it came off the green chain. And these jacks consisted of about a 10 by 10 timber sitting on some wedge-shaped blocks. And when you backed in underneath this thing, the rollers on the back of the truck deck or the trailer would start to take the weight of the load off of these timbers. And then you chained the load to the truck and pulled ahead, and these blocks slipped down off of these wedges, these cross pieces, and they were free under the load. And when you pulled out of there, you had to pull these out and drop them on the ground, and then tie your load down and head for Passmore. Well, the one truck they had was an International a tandem, with tandem rear wheels and so on, and it was very poorly built. The designers thought that if you took a 5-ton truck and took the rear end out of it and put 2 3-tons, you'd have a 6-ton truck. Well, those 3-ton truck rear ends just were hopeless in that situation, because every now and then, under certain circumstances, most of the driving force or the carrying load came on one axle because of a hump or a hollow in the road or whatever. And even in spite of the equalizing apparatus that was built in, these axles just kept failing all the time. And they did everything they could think of but the right thing, which was they should have taken them out and put the 5-ton rear ends in, and that would have been the end of their problem, which eventually happened. But this tandem truck was having periodical troubles, and this old Hayes was a real old battle axe. It just seemed to never break down, you know. And I drove that blessed thing, and when you were going back over that dry, hard road, you know, your eyeballs were just bouncing in your head. It was that rough. You know, things were blurry if you tried to make any time. So I got them to come and look at the front springs. I said the front springs should have been longer so that the rear shackle, instead of being straight up and down, should have been at a slope. Because now when you bounce upwards, and there's no such thing as shock absorbers in those days, these things have a tendency to go the wrong way. And then when you come down, why, it's just like it's solid. So I got one of the mechanics to come down and look, and he agreed. But we couldn't change the location of the axle. So we had to measure the spring from the front end to the axle, which was the front end was the anchor end, to the axle, and that had to remain the same. But we increased the length of the back end by 2.5 inches, and that put the back shackles on a slope, and the rest of the spring leaves were graduated to suit that. And I couldn't believe that I was going to get this kind of a response from my complaint. But by golly, in a week's or 10 days' time, there was a brand new set of springs there, built by the Dendorf Spring or one of those outfits, exactly to those specifications, and you wouldn't know you're riding in the same truck. So it happened that this other truck broke down, and I had to work all day and half the night to keep the mill clear so they could start in the morning. And so I'm trying to speed things up. Now the guy with the tandem truck, you see, he had power on those rollers, chain driven from a power takeoff, and he could back in underneath there and no trailer to worry about. You could back that thing within a half an inch of being perfectly balanced side to side and put those rollers in power and pull the load forward on his truck off of those jacks. No problem, just drive away, you know, chain down the load. He could lock those things so they couldn't unroll. So I get thinking, you know, maybe I can do that somehow with this apparatus that I'm driving, and the rollers were freewheeling on this thing. So I got me 2 wooden wedges, or 4 of them, and I backed in underneath this load, and I had to pull out slightly up grade. And to chain that load on meant you had to climb up on top, and we were hauling 10,000 board feet to a load, you know. So you had to climb 5 or 6 feet up on top and pull all the chain up. They didn't have cable wrappers as we do nowadays. There was no room in there to throw the chain over. You're standing, just barely room to walk in there, you see.
Because you're under a shed roof.
Yes, under the roof of the green chain. So I got all this on there, and then I drove these wedges in under this rollers so that the rollers shouldn't be able to turn backwards. And then I got in the truck and I started to drive out of there. And I drove right out so that I could pull these 10 by 10s out from under there, and I'd have room to throw the wrappers over, you see. Well, I just got out of the truck onto the running board, and I noticed these rollers starting to turn backwards. Well, slowly, you know, but they were going, and these wedges I'd driven in there just weren't enough to hold that weight. Well, I'm telling you, I jumped back in the truck and put the truck in reverse and tried to back in to the mill again to stop the load from rolling off. Well, I no sooner got the truck barely in motion, and that load went off there like a deck of cards back in underneath the mill, you know. Just green lumber, just fresh cut, you know, out of the mill pond and so on, you know. Heavy as all hell. Well, when that load went back underneath the green chain, the front end of the load was still sitting on the trailer. And the way the trailer was designed, the rear roller on the trailer was a couple of feet back of the rear wheels. So with that much weight on there, it picked the back wheels of the truck right off the ground. by 6 inches or so. You know, that load of lumber would weigh a good 20 or 25 tons, you know. And I had half of that load right on the back roller of that truck. So there she sits. You couldn't move the truck, you see. So I went over to the office, and I said to this fellow, I can't remember his name now, Crane. Bob, I think his name was Bob, if I'm not mistaken. Jack Crane. I believe that was his name, Jack Crane. He was from Enderby or someplace. And he was a logger type of guy, you know. And I said, Jack, or whatever his name was, come on, have a look over here. So, you know, and this is right after supper. So we go over there, and he was a man of few words. He always stood with his tongue in his cheek like that. And at least I thought it was his tongue. Maybe he had a wad of tobacco in there, I don't know. But anyway, I don't suppose he was more than 2 or 3 years older than I was, if anything, you know. He said, can you get it out of there? And I said, yeah. Okay, get it out. So I got some planks, and I laid them on the ground under the back wheels. And the front end of them was up behind the cab. And I tied some chain around these planks and took it down and hooked it in between the wheels. You know, the wheels had holes cut in them, the bud wheels, on both sides. And that's not something you do 2x12s, you know, and I doubled them and so on and put them in there. And then I started the truck up and I put her in gear, and as it wound up and pulled on the chain, it pulled those planks into the ground and just pulled itself right out of there till that load dropped on the ground. Then I just backed up a little bit and got the chains loose and undid them and unwrapped them, and so the truck is free. Now he says, go and get your time. And I said, well, if I'd have known that, I'd have let you get it the hell out of here, best way you knew how. And I expressed myself fairly clearly, you know, as to what I thought of him. And I went out and I caught a ride down out of camp somehow, got home. So that would be, next morning was Tuesday morning or something, and so towards the end of the week, I met up with some of the other guys from the camp, and they said, hey, Bob, they said, they're just having a hell of a time. In the meantime, it snowed, and they put another guy on this truck who I knew well, 2 or 3 years older than me, and he'd driven for 5 years more than I had, you know. He was a good driver too, but Jesus, he got into so much trouble with that thing. He lost a load of lumber right on the bloody highway. He got stuck on a hill, and he kept rocking and trying until finally he didn't realize the wrappers came loose and the bloody load rolled right off on the bloody highway, and they had a crew down there for 2 days cleaning up that bloody mess, picking it up and so on. And I thought, good for you guys. I felt sorry for Bill, the guy that took over from me, but anyway, Saturday, you know, 6 days a week those days, you know, Saturday I went into Page and Cady and Page's office and asked for my time, my pay. And the girl said, well, what's your name? And I told her, and she said, well, we don't have your pay made up for you. And Page heard this conversation. He came out of the office. He said, what's going on? And I said, well, I came to get my pay. Your pay? I said, yeah. I said, Crane fired me for spilling a load of lumber under the mill, and I come to get my pay. That was last Monday. To hell with that, he said. Get back out there and get to work, he said. Keep that bloody mill clear. that was the end of that episode. But that's how it went, without any kind of union organization and so on, if you could represent yourself, you might have a half a chance. But if you couldn't, you were history, to use modern terminology. And so this kind of thing followed me all the way through my life, working experience, to the extent that years later, when I was working at the West Kootenay, and I had a Class 1 driver's license, I still have, and my foreman in the shop down there, a fellow named Dick Malloy, he said, "Bob, how in the hell did you ever get your air ticket and Class 1 license?" He said, "I'm sure it wasn't in the conventional manner." He said, "Usually some episode involved with it." I said, exactly what happened. I might have related to you the time when you were here before how that did happen when the examiner came to camp and was informing us that tomorrow or sometime soon they would be up here to check us all out and see who qualified, and here was all the papers to read up on and study to get your air ticket and so on, and your Class 1 license and so on required that you have this air ticket. And I had an industrial air ticket, which is over and above what you needed for highway use. It was based on the railroad qualifications and standards, and it was used in heavy logging operations at the coast and hardly ever up here.
And you'd gotten it when you lived on the coast?
I had gotten it somehow or another. I just wrote exams and got it, and it was a little different than the present air ticket. It had a big red band right across it was like the cardboard license, and so on, but it had a special mark on it to designate it as industrial. And I carried that for all the years I was actively employed in that kind of work, and then I let it go. And I just have a conventional air ticket now for highway use. But what happened is that this fellow came around and notified us that very soon in the future there was going to be an examiner in the area, and it was him, the same guy that was notifying us. But out of a clear blue sky, I come down one morning with a load of logs to the weigh scales, and here's this guy in coveralls, and he had a pad like you have, clipboard and so on, and some tools in his back pocket, and he said to the guy ahead, whatever he was saying I couldn't tell, but pointing over there and so on. So the guy drove off the scales and drove over there and parked, and then he was checking him out, and I drove on the scales, and they weighed me, and before I left, he came up to me and he said, "I want you to pull over there and check your truck out." And I thought, well, who is this guy, And so I pulled over there, and the other truck left, and he said, "I'm going to check your air equipment and see how it's functioning, and so forth." So I owned the truck, you see. So other trucks were, by and large, Kootenay Forest trucks, but there were about an equal number of owner-operator rigs there too. But the one owner-operator outfit had 4 or 5 trucks on the job, whereas I had one, I think, at that time, maybe 2. And so he proceeds, and this was after I'd worked at Kootenay Forest. This was after I had worked at West Kootenay Power. And the mechanic, as I spoke about, that asked me how I got this ticket, and he said, "Not in the usual manner." It happened that I called back in there when I was trucking on my, later on, hauling low bed work, and I came down there to haul some machinery and transformers for them, and we got into this discussion. So this fella started to undo two of the air lines. And the proper manner to undo any copper tubing or any other flexible air line or swivel fitting is to hold the stationary piece that's screwed into the main body with one wrench and turn the other piece with another wrench. Don't just walk up and turn it, because what can happen is the stationary piece might come loose, and you don't want that to happen. And if you don't do it properly, you might twist the seat one against the other and put a groove in it, and then the damn thing will never hold. It'll never hold air or fluid or whatever you're putting through it. So he does this with two wrenches in the proper way, and I'm watching him. Then he changed his mind, and he tightened that back up, and he reached in there to undo it at a different place, and he just used one wrench. And I said, just a minute. I said, you don't undo it that way. And he said, if you don't like what I'm doing, I'll just draw a line through this, he said, because this is a condition of employment with Kootenai Forest Products. I said, you do what the hell you like. I said, that might be your job, but that's my neck if that bloody thing isn't working right. And he stopped right there, and he said, okay. I said, furthermore, let me see your qualifications for doing this job. So he started dishing out papers then and showing me, and he apologized, and he went back and did it right. And he just wrote past. And when they came the evening exam, I had coached some of the other fellows who were lacking even more than I in formal education, and because English wasn't their first language, they had considerable difficulty reading these forms, and so I'm sitting there coaching, and he's sitting there listening, not saying anything, but several of them got their license because of that, and so on. And he just sat there and agreed. He says, you don't have anything to worry about, you've got yours. And so I said, well, these fellows don't understand the terminology here, and I said, I just want them to know exactly what we're talking about so they don't fail by default or something, you see. So he never objected. He coached these guys through it. And so
is that because their first language was other than English?
Yeah, they were Russian. They spoke Russian until they started school in lots of cases, And so the English language in so many respects is very complicated to them, because their Russian language, like lots of European languages, are similar to French, where you switch the nouns around and so on, and the sentences seem to read backwards and all that sort of stuff. But that's getting away from the issue. I said earlier that these kind of problems of running into these confrontations with somebody in management type or wherever, officialdom, kept my pot boiling for me all my life pretty well. And one of the last major episodes was when I was working for Kalesnikoff Lumber in later years as a mechanic, and the IWA set the pattern for agreements throughout the province, even for non-union operations. And that too is another failure on the part of a lot of the working public to realize when they are out speaking so harshly against the unions that a lot of the benefits they've got came because somebody else established them and paid a price in many cases to get them established. And so Pete Kalesnikoff had built up his business there, and to a great extent he was capitalized by the Industrial Development Bank or some similar source of revenue, of capital. And so he held a few meetings with us employees that he was going to put in place a profit-sharing plan. And I thought, oh boy, this is really something. I should go back and say that an incident arose prior to that. An incident arose where a construction project was going on at 7 Mile Dam on the Pend Oreille River, and there was opportunities for truck drivers and so on to go to work there at construction rates of pay, which are normally somewhat higher than the steady employment jobs like IWA and whatever other trucking jobs there are. So two of the drivers for Kalesnikoff Lumber, both of whom were employed as chip truck drivers, because Kalesnikoff had no permit for a burner. That was one of the conditions he got that location, keep it clean, and he's done an excellent job in that respect. So he had two fellows driving chip trucks, one on day shift, one on afternoon, and I think they rotated, whatever. So it came to his attention via the Teamsters Union that these people had applied for membership in the Teamsters Union. And so the organizer or business agent for the Teamsters came around to see Kalesnikoff's and wanted to organize his crew under the Teamsters. And I thought, well, this is completely haywire. You know, here I am working in the shop. I was working steady afternoons. Under most union contracts, nobody is compelled to work steady afternoon shift. You might take steady night shift or steady day shift, but not steady afternoons. But it wasn't an inconvenience for me, and it was the only time of day when you could have some machinery in the shop that was in the bush, normally working in the bush. So that was my job, and I enjoyed it. Anyway, and I was the only employee in there on that shift. I was working by myself, which is probably got a safety factor attached to it in some ways, you know, but everything was working very well. And so one evening, as soon as this business agent from the Teamsters had come around, Pete came over to the shop just as the chip truck drove in, and the chip truck driver drove in to get me to fix something. I don't know whether it was a light or what it was, but it was something minor like that. And Pete called the driver outside, and I guess they had it out really bitterly. And Pete went right back through the shop and into the office. And the driver came to me and after, and he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, Pete threatened to fire me, and so on, and he said, I may get fired yet. So after a while, maybe an hour or so later, Pete came over to the shop, and he said, Bob, I am so angry, he said, and he used to talk these things over with me. And he said, I'm so angry at these fellows doing this, going to the Teamsters Union to get organized, this whole crew here, and so on. And he said, I think I'm going to fire them both. We were getting little booklets about, you know, about the size of this, about like that thing there.
Like a pamphlet.
Yeah. And it came out about once a month from the Interior Truck Loggers Association. And it was divided into the Northern and Southern and maybe even Central. Interior Truck Loggers Association. And this was a group of independent operators that had banded together to bargain for better hauling and trucking rates and so on. And in this was an article about an employee in the Smithers or Terrace area, somewhere up there, that had gotten, Hazelton, wherever, had gotten fired by his employer for joining a union.